Okay, we're going to get started now with our meeting. My name is Dennis Speed, and on behalf of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, I want to welcome you today to today's Saturday Dialogue with Lyndon LaRouche. This is July 22nd. 48 years ago, this was the concluding day of man's first visit to another planet, or planetary body rather, the moon. Last week when we met for the Manhattan Project, we pointed out that there was a particular task that we had to take up, in that in the United States, it is necessary to shift the United States and its presidency to an entirely different cultural platform, cultural and economic platform. If you compare the 9-year period that has passed since 2008, when the infamous bailout was forced through the Congress of the United States, until now, you take that period of time from 2008 until 2017, and you compare that to the period of time between January 20th of 1961 and July 20th of 1969. You compare those two Americas, the story of the necessity of the Manhattan Project is easily demonstrated. In that period of time, man was able, through the leadership of President Kennedy, himself building upon the leadership earlier of Franklin Roosevelt, to change the course of human history and to upshift humanity. In the corresponding period of 2008 until now, we've had a downshift of humanity, best exemplified or worst exemplified by the Obama presidency. But it was really a combination of processes that got us there. And it's that combination of processes that we mean to reverse. So what we're going to do is go right to our presentation of today. And Diane will start us off, and we will be followed after that by Mr. Tom Wysmuller, who's with us, that is remotely with us. And then we'll go into our questions and answers. So Diane.
Thanks. So is it possible to get that slide? Oh, I see. That's the only thing that'll be visible. Oh, there's Tom. Hi. All right. Well, that's too bad. Anyway, that's fine. That's much more interesting looking than me at this podium. As we said in the email, we are observing currently the 48th anniversary of the first landing on the moon, which was actually, I think, on July 20th. And then I think Armstrong actually made his famous step on the 21st of July. And I'm really glad that Tom Wysmuller, who was at NASA during this and is a NASA scientist, will be with us speaking following what I wanted to say. I wanted to put this picture up here, which I think was taken actually before we landed on the moon, but the first mission that actually went out and orbited the moon in 68, I believe. Because you've heard, I mean, I think it's just worth reflecting on what it would have meant to be the first person to ever see the Earth from this perspective, and to see this perspective before anyone had ever seen it or anyone ever knew that that's what our planet would look like from the moon. And what Lyndon LaRouche has dedicated his life to in terms of the question of physical economy is the relationship between human creativity and economy, and not economy in terms of money as people tend to think about it, but human economy in terms of what, sorry, it's just a little distracting. Anyway, human economy in terms of what does it take for mankind to actually achieve its existence as a human species, as a part of the biosphere and noosphere, as Vernadsky described it. Because Mr. LaRouche has said many, many times, what is mankind? What's the purpose of mankind? Each one of us, I think we can be fairly certain, and I'm not going out on a limb, each one of us is mortal. Each one of us individually is going to die. I don't think any of us can point to a person who's been here for 1,000 years or more that we know. So that we know to be the case. But mankind as a species, because of our ability to be creative, is not mortal. That unlike all the other species, 98 or 99% of which have already gone extinct, because that is simply a natural part of the process of the development of our universe and of our galaxy, human beings do not need to go extinct, because presumably we can make discoveries that allow us to change our relationship to nature. And contrary to what a lot of environmentalists believe today, human beings can make discoveries that actually transform nature, that actually change nature and improve it. That is, human beings make nature better. And in fact, as Jason Ross pointed out, it is the case that right now we are living in a synthetic environment. We are not living in nature. Probably, in fact, right here in this room, we have electricity, we have air conditioning, we have walls, we have clothing. We are definitely in an environment which has been created by human society and is not some kind of barbaric state. So it really shouldn't be such an odd idea to think that we can create other synthetic environments on other planets. As Kraft Erica thought of planet Earth, it was just a great blessing that we ended up here on this planet, which is just such a phenomenal driver of life. You drop little seeds on the ground and they grow, it's green, we can go outside, we don't need to be in a bubble, we didn't have to create the atmosphere. But from here, we can actually develop and travel throughout the universe. Can we have the next slide? Thanks. Is it possible to just leave that? Sorry. Okay. Anyway, so I chose this because I thought, supposing we had not yet created our synthetic environment, and supposing we didn't know anything about the universe, and you can think back even before Eratosthenes, but what were human beings confronted with, and what would you begin to, if you were trying to figure out the meaning of your existence and where you were, you might begin by observing the heavens. And you might begin to notice that certain of these lights that you see every night, if you devised instruments to track them on Earth, that they seem to change their positions. And some of them would change their positions in ways that seemed fairly uniform, and others of them would do all kinds of interesting things, like go around and make a loop, or other things that you couldn't figure out how to explain until you got an understanding of the relationship of our planet to the rest of the world. And in 232 BC, you had in Egypt a scientist, Eratosthenes, who had a hypothesis that not only the Earth was round, was a spherical shape, but that he could actually measure the circumference of the Earth, which he did by measuring shadows in two different locations when the sun at one of the locations was directly overhead. So by figuring out what the angle was between these places, he was able to make a remarkably good approximation of what the size of our planet was. Now think about that, 232 BC, that was an awfully long time before Christopher Columbus. But I think it also shows you something that we have to consider today, which is what is the effect of a dark age. what is the effect of the Roman Empire? What was the effect of the Roman Empire? What is the effect of empire on science? Where would mankind have been if the discovery and measurements of Eratosthenes had been allowed to permeate Europe and continue to develop, if they had not run into the oligarchical and usurious forms of society and banking that they have then? And as we now go into what I wanted to talk about in terms of just reflecting on where we are and where we should be, which is the situation with the Manhattan transportation grid. I think it's really important. There are two, we should be angry. We shouldn't be enraged, because rage is very destructive, and rage always is particularly destructive for the person who carries it. But there is a point to reflect on the fact that that photograph was 49 or so years ago. We had people on the moon 48 years ago. I guess the last trip to the moon was in 72. We haven't been back since. Not only that, we could not get there at this point. We don't even produce the parts and components that we need to get there. If people read the latest EIR article, you may have seen that we have a scientist at Princeton working sort of in tandem with the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab, who's working on developing fusion-propelled rockets, which is something Kraft Erica said we should have. Well, the place on the planet that right now is working on fusion is China. That's where they're likely to make the next breakthrough, not here. But thanks to the insanity of Obama and others, we cannot talk to the Chinese. So here he is working on a potential breakthrough. The people making the breakthrough in fusion are the Chinese, and the American scientist is not allowed to talk to them because of our ridiculous policy. He's also not allowed to talk to Russians. And I can tell you, I was at a conference in New York it was called a real estate conference, which is appropriate. They were purporting to address the transportation crisis. And I met some engineers there, and I called back one of the engineers and I said, I'd really like to invite you to this conference that we're holding, and we're going to have a very high-level delegation from China. He said, oh, I can't go. I said, what do you mean? He said, given my job security, I am not allowed to even talk to, I can't even meet with anyone who is not a US resident and citizen. I cannot even meet with people from outside of the United States. I mean, that is how insane it is. And I was reflecting, even Dr. Edward Teller, the Hungarian-American scientist who developed the laser technology, who worked with Lyndon LaRouche, who was very concerned for US defense. Edward Teller said, you cannot put a patent on scientific breakthroughs. A scientific breakthrough is an understanding of a universal principle. It's in the universe. Who owns a universal principle? But if you try to do this, then obviously you create dark age conditions, because everybody has to invent the wheel all over again. So here we are many decades after this phenomenal breakthrough, and now go to the next slide. And we are having, this is a picture of this is my brilliant photography of driving on the George Washington Bridge. This is the George Washington Bridge, just from the driver's side. Do the next one. Another picture of the George Washington Bridge. And it's not even in that bad condition relative to other things, but you can see, I can't imagine having a huge amount of rust is a very healthy thing for a bridge that was built in 1929-31. Next. This is on my way driving to the chorus in Brooklyn. If you can see, in fact, you can see me taking the picture in the mirror, but you see that wood down there? This is a ramp to get on routes 1 and 9 in New Jersey. And someone was good enough to come up there and put a bunch of pieces of plywood over this gaping hole through which you can look down to the road below. is this a repair, or is it just done so you don't get scared when you drive over the bridge? I'm not sure. I certainly hope that we're not depending on that wood to support the weight of the vehicles in any case, but just another example of what it looks like in the greater New York City metropolitan area. Next. Okay, so now we get to what really got me thinking about this. As people know, I am one of the directors of the Schiller Institute Chorus. And when you direct a chorus, you have any body of musicians, and it's like actually productive work, which not many people do anymore. But musicians are expected to be places on time. That is, the quality of ensemble depends on people arriving at the same time. And then not only that, you're supposed to be at the same place at the same time in the music that the conductor is conducting. And what was happening is the accompanists were showing up late and members of the chorus were showing up very late. And you know that the pianists who are, studying at the Manhattan School take themselves very seriously, and they kept getting stuck in the subway. And then we would hear that someone was late because the train they were on, there was a fire in the subway, and they were stuck for an hour and a half, and they would come in at the end of the, so I said, my gosh, this is really kind of a mess. What is going on with our transportation system? Then a few of our organizers were driving across the, Gothel's Bridge, coming off Staten Island, and blew out 3 tires in a single pothole. So you can add $500 to the toll as you drive across. And so, of course, what it turns out is the infrastructure, the subways, the rail, et cetera, are anywhere from 70 to 100 years old all across the city. And it is now at the point, as one person said, they had really remarkable engineering in the 1920s, because he was looking at the switches under the subway. We have only one line now that I think has computerized switches. They're talking about getting another one. And he said they were built in the 1920s and 30s, and they're still working, most of them. And we are depending on this. He said no one knows what their life expectancy is. They just did a remarkably good job at that time. He reported having seen an inspection sticker on one of these that said inspected 1952. That was the last inspection of that. So it's not really surprising. In fact, any engineer will tell you that when they build something, a construction worker, they have a pretty good idea of what the life expectancy of that is. Some of us met with our friend from the American Society of Civil Engineers here, and I was asking about the tunnels, and he said, well, cast iron has a life expectancy of about 150 years. And so the outside of these tunnels is made of cast iron. So even just that, forget the stuff inside the tunnel, which has generally a shorter life expectancy. But you would say, okay, if we're getting near to 150 years, wouldn't you think that we would have a new tunnel built or several or have a plan for that? Well, no. We don't. And what you have now is because Pennsylvania Station, up until the closure of the 3 lanes where the traffic, I think, has been reduced a bit. They've cut 20% from Long Island Railroad, a similar amount from New Jersey. But prior to that, the number of commuters passing through Penn Station on a given day was 650,000. And that station was designed for about 250,000. Now, it's the same for every single way into the PATH trains are over capacity. The George Washington Bridge, anyone who's ever tried to cross during rush hour or seen the Cross Bronx, how about the Cross Bronx? It's more like a parking lot, okay? Anyone who has traveled into the city from Long Island, New Jersey, Connecticut, anywhere, can probably guess that during rush hour, and that means if you take the day as a whole, virtually every single way that we enter the city is over capacity. So I said, when I learned that they were going to be closing 3 out of the 21 tracks of Penn Station for repairs, beginning what has come to be known as the Summer of Hell, that it wasn't merely delays and dislocation that would be caused, but because you would be forcing a dislocation of traffic from one area to other areas which are already over capacity, which already can't handle, like that plywood on the bridge that I showed, that what you are going to create are conditions which are ripe for a major disaster, because you're just moving the excess from one location to another. Next. So this is now what is happening. I think this is in Penn Station as part of the Summer of Hell. You can see it's really comfortable and spacious in there. Let's do the next one. This is recently when people heard about the fire at 145th Street, a trash fire. This is at 168th Street that day. And what happened as a result of 4 lanes being closed because of the fire is that the other lanes and platforms, and also you see how crazily dangerous our system is here. See those crowds right up against the track? I mean, how easy would it be for a whole bunch of people to fall on the track? If people panicked or whatever, you see the lines going way back up around the stairs. Go on. This is a picture that I took, which was a day that we happened to come into the city for a meeting, and there was an incident down at 18th Street. And when we tried to get on the trains at Penn Station, the 1, 2, or 3 line to get back up to Harlem where we parked our car, you couldn't get on the train. You had to wait on one platform. You could wait for 3 trains and maybe get on. We ran around and figured out how to get on a different line train going in the same direction. So when we got on the train, we could at least sit down, but by 2 stops later, it was completely packed like sardines. It was a day that was over 90 degrees. The car had no air conditioning. And people know Elliot. Elliot was wearing his glasses, which steamed over as if you were in a sauna. So it's probably over 100 degrees in this car, and you're packed in there like a sardine. And I was praying, since I've been looking at this stuff, just praying that we were not going to get stuck in a tunnel somewhere. Because if we were, you know, and you can imagine one thing, just one little thing, someone who is ill, who throws up, or someone who has a panic attack, and you're stuck in this car, and what happens? And in fact, when they had the fire at 145th Street, there was a car that was stuck that couldn't get there. And so these people were stuck in a car in a tunnel that was filling up with smoke. 10 people had to be hospitalized, and several people did have panic attacks. And as far as I know, nobody died, thank God, but someone could have had a heart attack or a stroke or anything in that situation. So this is really an accident waiting to happen. Is there one more? Is that one? Yeah. Oh, no, go back. I don't want that one yet. Okay, so we'll leave this. So I just, when I talked to Mr. LaRouche about the transportation, this mess, he said, you've got to pull together a committee who can put together a picture of this. And one of the first things he said is you want to forecast what, in a sense, he didn't exactly use these words, but what happens if you do nothing? Because I was thinking about LaRouche's forecasts, and people know that he would say that on the current trajectory we are on, if nothing intervenes, the entire transatlantic system is going to crash. You are going to see chaos. So what, there were 2 things that were said, which were very interesting. One was my sense that you literally, we're in a situation where if something is not done immediately on an emergency basis, people are going to die. it is almost impossible that people would not die. If they don't, it is only because, in part, of the luck and the unique nature of Manhattan that New Yorkers are so egregious and smart and will look out for each other and will try and do extraordinary things to prevent loss of life. But you cannot have conditions like this where you have temperatures of 100 degrees plus and people packed in and fires and things like that. So this was what I was thinking, and Hal Cooper, our friend who does a lot of work on rail, he said, what you have to consider is that Manhattan is very central for the economy of the United States. And I don't mean Wall Street per se, most of which we could probably do better without, but what I mean is, if you think of corporations, if you think of organizational headquarters, you think of what's here, that if Manhattan were to go into total pandemonium and chaos, because what do you think, what happens when one of these incidents occurs and people do die? Is the population just going to be calm? Is there going to be mass unrest? Are there going to be riots? I don't know. I don't know what will happen in those conditions. And if that were to happen in Manhattan, what is the impact of that on the entire United States and the entire economy of the United States, and also thereby the economy of the world, certainly the transatlantic situation? Now, I'll just show you the next slide, which is because people may have heard about this. Elon Musk has developed something that we've been talking about for at least a couple of decades, and the Chinese have been doing research, but a maglev tube in a vacuum tunnel, which he says can go up to 800 miles an hour, and that you could have a loop between New York City and DC, and you could get to DC in 29 minutes. Well, it's very likely that you could do that. However, the idea of acting as if this is a solution when we have no platform in Manhattan currently in shape to handle having such technology, I'm not sure. I think the DC subway situation is also in a terrible mess. In other words, what is the infrastructure that would allow you to have this? And to show you how silly it gets, because the terms that all these people think in are just monetarist terms. So he wanted to build it above ground because that would be less expensive. But he said people are going to be too upset about their property rights. And if you want to go at 800 miles an hour, you need it to be straight. You can't have all these turns. So we can save a lot of money by building it underground because we won't have to buy everyone's property from them. But that is not a solution to what we're looking at when the entirety of the city of New York is about to disintegrate. It'll be like privatized space flight. A few millionaires can risk their lives because the safety record, if you've seen how SpaceX is doing, is not too great. It's not like NASA, okay? That you can take your life in your hands, pay $1 million, and be a tourist on the moon. What does that do for mankind? What does that do for the population of the United States? What were the benefits that we and the world attained because of the space program and because it was a government-funded program, which had at least an order of magnitude more private businesses and private companies that were feeding into it. It was a driver of the whole thing. But the point is that it was taken from the top. Now, go back to the crowding picture, because I want you to just have this in mind. So what are we looking at here? They're saying that it's possible that the repairs in Penn Station are not going to be done by Labor Day. which is not surprising because I would imagine when you look at something like what it probably looks like down there and no one's even thought of repairing it and no one's had the money to talk about repairing it, you'll get down there and you'll discover a whole bunch of other things that needed to be repaired that you didn't know about. So if it's not, and we still have this, and frankly, even if it is, because everything is disintegrating simultaneously. Oh, and I didn't even talk about the 71st Street fire. Let me just also add that because it really, one night, again, people were late for chorus because there was a fire at 71st and Broadway under the ground with smoke coming up out of the manhole cover. So we had a meeting there for the steering committee of the chorus the next night. And they were doing all this construction. And I figured, well, the construction's probably related to the fact they had a fire underground. The woman who rents us the place where we meet told us they hadn't had electricity for 24 hours, but luckily it had just been turned back on before a meeting, but don't use the elevator. Now, luckily, we were only on the second floor, but because they didn't have full electricity, they didn't want people doing things where you used large amounts of electricity. So I went up to one of the workers and said, what happened? And he said, well, you know, it's been very hot. I said, yeah. He said, well, the ground gets very hot. And when it's very hot, people use a lot of electricity. And what had occurred is the casings of the electrical cables under the ground had melted, and that's what caused the fire. So it was the electricity itself having it that caused the fire, and what they were doing was repairing the cables and the casings in that particular location. But one would ask oneself, well, if that's happening there, did Manhattan get electricity like each part of it 25 years apart? Or was it electrified probably all around the same time, which means in my mind, and maybe I'm completely wrong and an engineer who builds the city can tell me, but I would suspect that most of the underground cables were probably put in at around the same time in a given area, which seems to me to mean that you could have many more of these kind of accidents because you're not repairing the thing. So at any rate, that's the condition. So now take Labor Day weekend. We've got this dislocation of the trains from Penn Station. We've got the traffic having to get into the city by all different means. What happens after Labor Day in New York? Everyone comes back, right? Everyone comes back, the school's open, so you're gonna have high school students on public transportation, you're gonna have college students crossing the bridges, coming in every day. September 12th, I think, is the beginning of the UN General Assembly. So you're gonna have heads of state and foreign ministers and 10 million, armored vehicles and entourages and delegations. And the city, what is this going to look like? I mean, you could have total pandemonium. So I brought this up to Mr. and Mrs. LaRouche, and what they said is also what you have, and there are major alarming moves occurring in Italy right now where they're basically doing bail-in kinds of procedures. And oh, I know what they want to do. They want to sell all the non-performing debt. They want to put a timeline for getting rid of it. So while people normally would expect they might get 40% on the whatever euro or whatever they're selling it at, they're going to get 10 or 11%. And the non-performing debt is largely things that people own, like their homes and things like that. So what is going to happen is the plan is for the Italian banking system to be bailed out on the backs of the Italian people. That is going to have a certain kind of effect. You may have heard that the Dow, the stock market, is at a record high. Well, if you've ever stuck a balloon on a helium machine and put a whole bunch of helium in it, you'll notice that the time it's the biggest is right before it pops. So the fact that this market is an all-time crazy high when the standard of living the income and so on is like an all-time low relative to expenses, should indicate that we are very near a major meltdown of the financial system, which tends often to occur after the end of the third quarter, that is, at the end of September, early October. So what you're looking at is a confluence of the disintegration of Manhattan, which will become very obvious after Labor Day, and a blowout of the banking system occurring at the same time. And so therefore, our organization, and we'll talk about this more at the end and then the questions, is on a campaign mobilization that we have to get Glass-Steagall on an emergency basis as the first of LaRouche's 4 laws. That means a national banking system, that means a credit policy, that means emphatically a science driver, which is really what gives you the basis to do all of this. And we want to get this done before Labor Day. And I will just say the things that are being proposed so far are completely absurd. The new head of the MTA, Loda, has said that if we want to be safer, when you eat on the subway, you should just be neater. Neater, you know, throw your garbage around or take it with you in your purse. Okay, that will help solve this. The plans that Cuomo has approved, maybe to look good because maybe he's planning to run for president or something like that, is they want to take the old post office, Farley Post Office, and add it to Penn Station and move some of the Amtrak tracks under that, which would give us a little bit more space. But the really exciting thing about this plan is they're going to have a shopping mall, and it's going to have skylights. So if you're lucky enough to be able to get off your train and you are unlucky enough to not be able to get on any other train, you will be able to spend your time in the shopping mall, and you'll have skylights so you can see the sky. And this is what, I mean, it is literally that bad. It is that insane. And that is why I think it's really urgent that we reflect on where our nation has been, what the potentials are, and then we mobilize ourselves to crush this British-directed Wall Street financial usury and looting operation and organize a recovery. And the last thing I'll just say is the Treasury Secretary Mnuchin has been behaving in a completely despicable fashion. Not only is he opposed to Glass-Steagall, he's been unilaterally acting to impose sanctions on Russian businessmen. He has now investigated Exxon for violating the sanctions on Russia. So it'd also be good as part of this to get him out of there. But that's what I want to say. And what I would like to do now is just show you a video of a number of things from President Trump to President Kennedy to just, I think, reflect a little bit on how we did not need to be in this situation.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
My fellow Americans, this week, in the company of astronauts, I was honored to sign the NASA Transition Authorization Act right into law. With this legislation, we renew our national commitment to NASA's mission of exploration and discovery, and we continue a tradition that is as old as mankind. We look to the heavens with wonder and curiosity. More than 2 decades ago, One scientist followed this curiosity and dramatically changed our understanding of the universe. The year was 1995. Taxpayers were spending billions and billions of dollars on NASA's Hubble Space Telescope. The astronomer in charge had a novel idea. He wanted to use the expensive telescope in a totally unconventional way. Instead of pointing Hubble's eye at nearby stars or distant formations, Robert Williams wanted to peer into the void. He aimed the massive telescope at one of the emptiest regions of the night sky. For 10 days during Christmas of 1995, Hubble stared into the abyss, seeking whatever light it could glean from the darkness, and it was total darkness. Fellow astronomers didn't know if he'd see much of anything, but Williams was rewarded, and the entire world was struck by the awesome images of our satellite return. In that tiny patch of sky, the Hubble Deep Field showed thousands of lights. Each brilliant spot represented not a single star, but an entire galaxy. The discovery was absolutely incredible. But the unforgettable image did not satisfy our deep hunger for knowledge. It increased ever more and even more, and reminded us how much we do not know about space, frankly, how much we do not know about life. With this week's NASA reauthorization, we continue progress on Hubble's successor, the James Webb Space Telescope. It is amazing. The Webb telescope is set to launch next year. It will gaze back through time and space to the very first stars and the earliest galaxies in the universe. We can only imagine what incredible visions it will bring. At a time when Washington is consumed with the daily debates of our nation, I was proud that Congress came together overwhelmingly to reaffirm our nation's commitment to expanding the frontiers of knowledge. NASA's greatest discoveries teach us many, many things. One lesson is the need to view old questions with fresh eyes, to have the courage to look for answers in places we have never looked before, to think in new ways because we have new information. Most of all, new discoveries remind us that in America, anything is possible if we have the courage and wisdom to learn. In the span of one lifetime, our nation went from black and white pictures of the first airplane to beautiful images of the oldest galaxies captured by a camera in outer space. I am confident that if Americans can achieve these things, there is no problem we cannot solve. There is no challenge we cannot meet. There is no aim that is too high. Whatever it takes and however long it will be, we are a nation of problem solvers, and the future belongs to us. We are truly a great place to be. I love America. I'm here in the Oval Office along with my daughter Ivanka and astronaut Kate Rubins, who recently returned from space and from the space station. Together, we are being joined by students all across America, thousands and thousands of students who are learning. They're learning about space, learning about a lot of other things. Peggy, Jack, and Kate, I know that America's students are thrilled to hear from you. But first, I want to say that this is a very special day in the glorious history of American space flight. Today, Commander Whitson, you have broken the record for the most total time spent in space by an American astronaut, 534 days and counting. That's an incredible record to break. And on behalf of our nation and, frankly, on behalf of the world, I'd like to congratulate you. That is really something. And I'd like to know, how does it feel to have broken such a big and important record?
Well, it's actually a huge honor to break a record like this, but it's an honor for me basically to be representing all the folks at NASA who make this space flight possible and who make me setting this record feasible. And so it's a very exciting time to be at NASA. We're all very much looking forward, as directed by your new NASA bill. We're excited about the missions to Mars in the 2030s. And so we're actually physically have hardware on the ground that's being built for the SLS rocket that's going to take us there. And of course, the hardware being built now is going to be for the test flights that will eventually get us there. But it's a very exciting time, and I'm so proud of the team.
For we meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. The greater our knowledge increases, the greater our ignorance unfolds. Despite the striking fact that most of the scientists that the world has ever known are alive and working today, despite the fact that this nation's own scientific manpower is doubling every 12 years in a rate of growth more than 3 times that of our population as a whole, despite that, the vast stretches of the unknown and the unanswered and the unfinished still far outstrip our collective comprehension. No man can fully grasp how far and how fast we have come. But condense, if you will, the 50,000 years of man's recorded history in a time span of but a half a century. Stated in these terms, we know very little about the first 40 years, except at the end of them, advanced man had learned to use the skins of animals to cover them. Then about 10 years ago, under this standard, man emerged from his caves to construct other kinds of shelter. Only 5 years ago, man learned to write and use a cart with wheels. Christianity began less than 2 years ago. The printing press came this year. And then less than 2 months ago, during this whole 50-year span of human history, the steam engine provided a new source of power. Newton explored the meaning of gravity. Last month, electric lights and telephones and automobiles and airplanes became available. Only last week did we develop penicillin and television and nuclear power. And now, if America's new spacecraft succeeds in reaching Venus, we will have literally reached the stars before midnight tonight. This is a breathtaking pace. But I do say that space can be explored and mastered without feeding the fires of war, without repeating the mistakes that man has made in extending his writ around this globe of ours. There is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind, and its opportunity for peaceful cooperation may never come again. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Okay, so now we will turn this over to our friend Tom Wysmuller.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Tom, we're trying to get you some sound. Now we can see you. Okay, go right ahead.
How about listening? Can you hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Hey, that's great. Well, let me give you some background. Some of you know me. I worked with NASA before, during, and after the moon landings. It was my dream job. I was a young kid. Turns out that during the Apollo days, the average age of the employees at NASA was in their mid-20s. It's kind of hard to believe. We were all young, full of vision, and dedicated to getting us to the moon and into the future. So let me get the first slide up, if you don't mind. I have a couple of slides prepared, by the way, for this event. It's a postage stamp. It actually has a problem in it, and it's a juxtaposition of the Apollo landing and the Apollo 8 photograph that Diane showed before. Because you notice Earth is kind of on the horizon. Well, that's not what happened. During the moon landings, the Earth was literally overhead. But it makes for a great postage stamp, and we're celebrating a really, really neat achievement. And I want to look back at what we have achieved. We had 12 heroes who walked on the moon. It was a great time in history. And by the way, there may have been a couple of Russian heroes who died trying. This was humanity's first real exposure to the world beyond our world. Let me take a look at another shot in the next slide. This is actually a better image than the president showed. He showed the image of the Hubble Deep Field, but it was kind of underexposed. This is the whole thing, and you can see clearly each of those little points of light represents billions of stars and suns, most of which have planets. And this is a small little section, which if we look at it is totally dark. And the president got it right. He described the process, and it shows, and by the way, now we are looking into the past. We are looking billions and billions of light years into our past. We can't see you. We are circling around an infinite universe when we are looking at this. We may have passed the same spot a couple of times, but that's part of a course in cosmology. I don't want to get into it. But that's looking in the past. I want to turn around now and look to our future. As the president said, he's looking to Mars, and the next slide will kind of show you that. This is what Mars looks like. Nice big canyon. Go to the next slide, please. This is from Sky and Telescope. And we've named a lot of these features on the planet. We've named them after Greek mythology and biblical terms. Go to the next slide, please. We know a lot about Mars. In fact, this is the Viking lander. By the way, this is the 40th anniversary of the first lander that we landed on Mars. And after that, we've sent a number of them. It was about 3 days ago the first one landed. So in 40 years, we've learned a lot about the planet. We've had rovers on Mars. We've had rovers on the moon, and you saw a photograph of that too. So let's talk about the future of NASA. Next slide, please. This is the logo for NASA. Affectionately, we kind of call it the meatball. NASA has had other logos, but I want you to pay attention to the flourish, which goes from left to right, that red thing. Because in the next slide, you're going to see one of the heroes from Apollo. And this is Buzz Aldrin. And Buzz Aldrin, and by the way, if you see a slide here that I'm showing that has a NASA logo on top, there's a couple of more you'll be seeing. This is part of a presentation I gave at Johnson Space Center about 1.5 years ago when we were trying to look for direction of where to go with the agency. So here's Buzz Aldrin, second guy to walk on the moon. And he has his T-shirt on, and I'm going to show you a close-up of what the T-shirt says. But you notice that flourish. Here's a close-up. Now this is, keep in mind, Buzz is a pilot, a real hero. He doesn't mince words. But I want to describe some of the detail. You notice the flourish, by the way, I referred to, is going in a different direction. We want to turn this agency around. We want to get a new direction for NASA. And you notice there's two white spots. One of them is about 9 o'clock on the image, and the other one's around 2. And they represent the moons of Mars. The big one is the one on the left, and that's Phobos. Phobos is the inner moon of Mars. Deimos, the little one, is the outer moon. And Phobos is pretty special. See if you can wipe that slide out for a second, because I want to show you at least what I'm talking about. Can you remove the slide? Good. Okay, Phobos, the inner moon of Mars, is very fast. It goes around the planet 3 times in one day. The recommendation that Buzz has made, and I heartily endorse, is that we don't go to Mars first, we go to Phobos. Why do you want to go to Phobos? First of all, getting on and off of Mars requires an awful lot of energy. It requires ground support. You know, we launch a rocket from Cape Kennedy. We have literally hundreds and hundreds of people involved in that launch operations, fuel getting delivered, and all kinds of things happening. None of that exists on Mars. Mars has a lot more gravity than the moon. But if we go to Phobos first, we catch up to this fast-moving inner moon of Mars. We don't need that much fuel to brake and slow down because we're actually moving onto a fairly speedy moon. We stay on Phobos for about 1.5 years, do exploration. And I'm going to show you some pictures of what that could look like. And then when we leave from the other side of the planet and get a boost from the same fast-moving moon that requires much less fuel to get back to Earth, much less fuel than we'd ever need to land on Mars and then take off. And when on Phobos, we can do all kinds of things. Let's go to the next slide real quick and get you an idea of what Phobos looks like. Not that one, but the one after. This is Phobos, the little black dot you see there. It's very close to the planet, much closer than our moon. Go to the next slide, please. Here's an enlargement so you can kind of see what it looks like. And you notice it's a little bit potato-shaped. And the next slide will show you in a little bit better detail. So the first step in going to Mars is really going to Phobos. And Phobos is fascinating. You see the white patches, they're either water or frozen carbon dioxide. There are meteor craters in chains that look like the moon was machine gunned from some other set of meteors. They all come in a row. Big craters, small craters. A fascinating place to get. And how do you get there? Well, the way we got to the moon, we had to plan. We had to plan very, very carefully. We created something called a work breakdown structure. And if you imagine a giant wall filled with boxes, boxes in different shapes, some designating hardware, some designating processes, some designating linkages. And you fill that wall with all the things that you need to do to get to the moon. We did that. The problem was some of the things that we needed to get done didn't exist. We didn't even know if they could exist. We needed technology that hadn't been invented yet. So some of those boxes were blank. And what we did then, we came up with new contracting methods. We invented contracts called CPFF and CPIF, and it stands for cost plus fixed fee and cost plus incentive fee. And we would put these problems, and there were problems that we didn't have answers to, out to bid to companies and entities that we thought had a shot at making them. And if they did make them and they maybe did it better than we thought, we gave them an incentive fee. We picked up their costs anyway. I remember one of the jokesters at Goddard Space Flight Center where I was working had a work breakdown structure on a wall, had lots of blanks in there. And in those blanks, at one point, he put, then a miracle happens. And another one, he put, magic happens here. Because we didn't know whether that magic could happen. But we went out to American industry. We went all over the country, in New York, California, Texas, you name it. companies of names that you'd recognize today, Pratt & Whitney, Grumman, Fairchild, Texas Instruments. They all bid on some of these problems, and we were able to solve them. When all of the blocks in the work breakdown structure were filled and connected, we knew we could get to the moon. And that's the technology, the management technology that NASA employed in order to make that happen. Well, we need to do that to get to Phobos. Go to the next slide. You can see a small subset of a work breakdown structure that is just dealing with water handling. And each of those blocks has lots of things in it that also need to be solved and handled. Next slide, please. This is what a lander, this is a concept of a lander on Phobos. And you see the Orion spacecraft docked on the right side. The habitat would be the circular thing on the bottom. The astronauts would go there, they would take pictures. We would map that planet so thoroughly that we would have a total understanding of where landing sites could be. And we'd also do geological exploration on Phobos itself, which is utterly fascinating. And we'd stay there for about 1.5 years and then come back. You see 2 astronauts in there. This is just a concept. Again, a work breakdown structure has to be created to accomplish this, because every one of the things you see in this image has to be detailed, spec'd, measured, verified, validated, so that we know that these things can work, that a human life is going to depend on it, and that we will succeed in our task. And that's what we did in Apollo. We need to do the same. We need to basically, as Buzz Aldrin shows, turn the agency around and say, okay, this is a target. The reauthorization bill that the president signed makes this beginning happen, but it's only a beginning. There's lots of other things that we still have to do. Launching of Webb, by the way, next year is going to be neat. I've seen Webb in its hangar in Goddard Space Flight Center. Beautiful instrument, all designed to unfold in space and make sure that everything works. And again, a work breakdown structure for Webb is functioning. All the blocks are filled. We know that it is going to work. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is my concluding slide in my presentation at NASA. Going to Phobos is great, but it's not the voyage that matters. It's what we learned by taking the journey. It's a new technology that we have to invent. And by the way, when we went to Apollo, we had concepts called open patents, where if you patented something that was used for the moon program, it was open for everybody. You couldn't charge royalties on it because you were working for the government when you designed it. It made that technology available for the world. And that's the next line, is how well we use and spread that knowledge. And we have used and spread the knowledge from Apollo beautifully all over the entire planet. Virtually every human being has been affected in one way by the technology that was developed in the Apollo program. And it's absolutely incredible when you think about it. And I'm going down to the titanium coating on the spade that a ditch digger uses. None of that stuff existed before Apollo. And the medical technology that you have at your disposal when you go to a hospital today, and also in Europe and in China and in Russia, we have spread that all over the place. It has made this a wonderful planet to live on, much better because of that 10-year period that we worked like the dickens to make Apollo happen, landed on the moon, and brought those men back safely. So I end up concluding this is how humankind is going to flourish. And spacefaring is a really wonderful alternative to war. Now I want to add, and this is something Diane brought up, we do need to cooperate with other countries. If we're going to go to Phobos and we're going to go to Mars, I would love to see the Russians and the Chinese pay part of that bill, because the fact is this is a huge project. We do need to use other countries. They have technology available that we can use and vice versa. We need to get rid of the restrictions that for non-military and non-defense items, we can spread that knowledge. Fortunately, I don't have that restriction on myself because I'm not working for NASA anymore. So I can be a little bit more free when I travel to other countries and talk to people. We need to do that on a structured basis so that the Chinese and Russians can do it for us and we can do it for them. And by the way, I know, I'm sure you're aware that we are paying the Russians about $85 million per astronaut to send our people up to the space station, which I think is a wonderful example of international cooperation. But it means that we as a nation have lost that ability, at least temporarily. And it's like owning an island and sinking the rowboat that gets you out there. And the rowboat that we're borrowing is charging us an awful lot more than we used to pay for the shuttle. We would send 10 people up there for about maybe 200 million total for a shuttle launch. Much more efficient. And all those jobs, by the way, were down back at the Cape. So we have lost a lot of capability in this country. And that's, again, why turning around the agency and moving in a better direction is imperative for us. So I think you've heard enough from me. I celebrate Apollo for all the people that I work with. It was great. And I am still very proud of having worked with them. That's 2 thumbs up, by the way.
Thank you very much, Tom. All right, so we'll go right to questions. So just anybody wants to have a question, just line up right there and state your question, and we'll go to either Tom or Diane.
Hi, it's Bruce from New Jersey. It's not so much a question, but I've been reflecting on the recent meetings that the president has had with Putin and also with Xi Jinping. And in particular, the amount of time that went into the meeting with Putin. And I think in both meetings, what was occurring is that President Xi and Putin were looking for the responses that they probably expected from Trump, given the different circumstances that they were in, whether it was a question of Syria or sanctions or whatever, that they were looking to draw out of Trump really this American system. That's really what they're looking for. The collaboration, the kind of collaboration that you're talking about that occurred in NASA is the similar kind of collaboration that gets the kind of results that are really needed right now. So I really wanted to leave it at that because I think that's, or, if you want to look at Manhattan, it's the same thing. You have to find those people that are willing to collaborate to come up with the necessary solutions that can solve some very grave problems. And I would just like to say that I would like to take a little saying from President Kennedy, which I think should be applied now, whereas he said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And I think we should apply that. Ask not what President Trump can do for you, ask what you can do for President Trump to help out in this collaborative process.
Now you got 2 thumbs up from me, that's for sure.
Yeah, sure. Diane wants to respond to that first.
Yeah, and I think the rest of what Kennedy said is ask what our nation can do for mankind, which is what we really have to think. And what you said just reminded me of what Helga said explicitly, which is that, look, it is a big deal that President Trump had this meeting with Putin in spite of the outrageous Russiagate witch hunt insanity. I mean, anything that goes wrong in this country is now blamed on Vladimir Putin. They're probably going to blame him for the subways at some point. But at any rate, so in spite of that, Trump followed through on the meeting. They secured a ceasefire in Syria. I heard it announced that he has ended the CIA program of arming the alleged moderate Syrian rebels who did not exist, but who were chopping people's heads off. We are not planning to overthrow Assad at the moment anymore, which is excellent. And he has established clearly a strong friendship with Xi Jinping. This is very significant. It is an Achilles heel that what you're raising. In other words, if we do not get emergency measures, that is Glass-Steagall, and really crush Wall Street because there's more. The MTA was really set up under Felix Rohatyn, I understand, as part of the looting of Manhattan by Wall Street, just to create debt. In fact, almost everything in Manhattan is debt farming and primitive accumulation. If you think about what you pay to park, what you pay to cross the bridge, what you pay to live here, where is that money going? When I was going into the meeting just before I got here, I met an employee of the MTA, and she said, we're not getting the money, but the media wants to pit the passengers against the workers. And it's a real sleight of hand, because the agency that's ripping everyone off is Wall Street. It is that. So the danger is that if this crash occurs and President Trump has not addressed it beforehand, it becomes much easier to destroy his presidency and the country. It is a very weak point, which is why it is urgent. It's also why it's very clear that if you want to avoid war, then you do not want to destroy this presidency, because given the actions that he's been taking with Russia and with China, it's clear that the people who are attacking that also are the same people who would put us on a trajectory for a confrontation with Russia or China, which would not end very well for mankind.
Thank you.
Yes. Hi, Tom. Alvin here in New York. Thank you so much for that. It was brief, but really much I didn't know. I mean, Phobos, who knew? I had no idea. So these new ideas are great. I wanted to ask you about something a little closer, referencing the moon. China has committed to going to the far side of the moon and doing research there and opening things up in terms of our understanding of the solar system. Can you tell us what type of ideas like Buzz Aldrin and you and others have in terms of what our role should be on the moon? We talk about manufacturing, mining, it perhaps being a launch pad or a start point for an actual Mars mission. So could you tell us a little bit more about what we should be doing on the moon and if there are any plans for that?
Well, I'll give you two-part answer to that question. The first is, as far as the Chinese are concerned, what we should be doing, and I mentioned this before, is trying to work with them. Their whole objective on landing, putting a lander on Farside, I don't think they're going to put people there, but they're going to put a lander there. And Farside, during certain months, certain parts of the month, when we have a full moon as seen from Earth, the far side is completely shielded from any kind of radio interference, not only from the Earth, but also from the sun. And it gives a very clear, unmodified picture into the universe. If you have a telescope and or a radio telescope that works at wavelengths that can be useful for that kind of exploration. We haven't done that yet. Everything that we have sent up, including Hubble, has to deal with the radio pollution that we create here on Earth. And the sun, of course, emits radio waves of in all kinds of frequencies. So you want to be shielded from that. That's what Farside can do. What I'd like to do is make sure that America, at least, cooperates with the Chinese and that we will learn from them the same way they have learned from us and gotten and reaped the benefits of the technology that we've developed. Insofar as going back to the moon is concerned, there's talk about mining helium-3 on the moon, which supposedly is found at the bottom of craters, particularly craters near the lunar poles, and using that for fusion fuel if we develop a fusion engine. Now, part of that work breakdown structure and getting to Phobos and getting to Mars and maybe getting beyond is this mythical engine called the 1G engine. The 1G engine allows you to accelerate at 1G, which is Earth's gravity, on your way out to, let's say, if we get really exciting, to Saturn's moon Titan. Keeps 1G present so the astronauts feel like they can walk on Earth. And then halfway there, you flip the spacecraft around and you do 1G on deceleration so you can slow down. Meanwhile, the astronauts stay healthy because staying for months and months and months at 0G is a problem. And we have to solve that problem in going to Mars too. And there are different ways to do that. Can the 1G engine happen? Fusion may be necessary. And I used the word mythical before. This is one of those blanks. And maybe we can get to Phobos without a 1G engine. In fact, I think we have to use something other than a 1G engine to get to Phobos. But these are the kind of things that we can, if helium-3 is part of the equation, we will want to go to the moon and harvest it. There's other things we can learn by putting a small base on the moon. But at this point, I think America should at least look to getting and securing international cooperation to go beyond the moon, to go to Mars, to go to Phobos, and then look way beyond, long beyond my lifetime. But at least I can be very proud of the fact that I had a little piece of moving the agency in the direction that these things can occur in future generations that I would never even see.
Thank you very much, sir.
Next question, go ahead.
Hi there. My name is Jose Vega from New York. I had more of a comment than a question because when I tell people about what I do and I talk to young people about what it means to be human, I always tell them about the Apollo moon landing, how that event has redefined what it means to be human, what it means to share that title of being born on this earth. I tell them that every event that has happened in human history has also defined them where they come from. I've noticed that a lot of young people, but also a lot of adults, people my parents' age, about 40 or 50, have forgotten why they get up in the morning and go to work. They don't appreciate where they've come from, and they don't appreciate and they don't know the history of American ingenuity, where it's taken us from the steam engine, the railroad, all the way to the moon. And so I sort of struggle with this. How do we encompass people back into thinking bigger than just trying to survive, giving people goals and motivations to want to get up in the morning, to be excited, to live on this earth, knowing that something great is going to happen. So that's, and this presentation has sort of helped me answer that question, because Mars is where we need to be going next. Landing on the moon of Mars is where we need to go next. It's just people don't know this and they don't appreciate it. I mean, people are so blinded by all these other things and the Russia gate, but I guess, how do we encompass people to think bigger?
Tom, you have anything to say on it?
Yes, I do. You know, and the Russia gate is a good example, because it's already been determined that the Russians really did not influence our elections, even if in fact they may have tried. I think there's some record of the Obama administration trying to involve themselves in the Israeli elections, which wasn't very pleasant. But the fact is, every minute that's spent thinking about this Russiagate stuff is a minute that you're not thinking about going to Phobos or going to Mars. And I think that is the purpose of the political enemies who are trying to undermine the Trump administration. Get them distracted, make sure they don't make America great again. And that's something that we can't tolerate. So you have to get your head screwed on right, as you said. And the fact is, what you're doing in speaking out about it is great. And the more people you speak to, the better off the world will be. So thank you for doing so.
Thank you.
I also, Jose, I want to say something as well. There's different ways to motivate people. I think inspiration is the most effective, but I was thinking about Mr. LaRouche's approach to the forecast of what happens if we don't. And people have a really hard time thinking into the future. But it is also the case that at some point, I don't know when, a few billion years from now, most likely, if we are not hit by an asteroid or comet earlier, which is also a possibility, it is definitely the case, just as no one of us is going to be alive forever. our planet and our sun are not going to be in this shape forever. And we would do well to figure out over these however many years have been allotted to us to figure out how we are going to move mankind to a safer location.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Sherry. I'm from Manhattan, and I have an anecdotal story to tell you. My side of the family has been rather long-lived, and the family watched the man landing on the moon. And my grandfather, who was in his late 80s at the time, tears came to his eyes. I says, "Grandpa, are you all right?" He says, "You know, your grandmother's great-grandmother was born in a covered wagon pulled by oxen somewhere in Utah. And here I am, just a few generations removed. I saw the covered wagon as the mode of transportation in early 1950s. My father flew back in an airplane from covered wagon to an airplane back to New York to do some work with Bell Telephone Laboratories. And then you look at what hasn't happened. From that time of Kennedy, and here's my grandfather who spent a time of his life in probably the most productive era in this country, to where we're shoved in a closet. We should already have cities on the moon, as Mr. Kraft envisioned. Full cities. You'd check into a hotel on the moon. I'm sure they'd have had, artificial atmosphere, movies, whatever, entertainment, food. You could walk around. You wouldn't have to worry about floating up in the air. And all of that was retarded. And we're just now getting back to it. So what a shame. And what really brought this to mind was when Kennedy's talking about mankind in 50 years, and like every minute, some major thing happened. That closet door got shut right after they killed him. And we're just now reopening it if we can. So that's really all I have to say. Maybe where do we go from here to get back to where we were at that accelerated growth of knowledge and passing it on?
Okay, fine. They may not have anything to say to that particularly.
Well, every one of you has to open that door. You can't rely on the politicians to do it. You need to speak to them. You need to speak to your friends. You need to orient people so that they are thinking in terms of reigniting mankind's greatness. And by the way, we've been sidetracked by wars, by billions and billions of dollars that have been wasted. And it's being wasted right now. There was a time that we recently were spending $300 a gallon for biofuel for Navy ships that use billions of gallons when you could buy diesel for $1.65. And this kind of wasting of money prevents you from doing the things that are great.
That's right.
So I think the administration has its act together. It needs to get control of this wasteful spending. I think Pruitt at EPA is a great choice. We're on the way to doing things right, but we're just beginning.
Thank you.
Good. Thanks.
Okay. Good afternoon. This is Jessica from Brooklyn, New York. And I first want to, again, thank you for being with us today. It's, as Jose was saying, it's amazing to listen to your presentation and see what needs to be done next, especially when it comes to the ideas of first landing on Phobos and on our way to the moon. Now, I'm a science teacher, middle school, New York City Board of Education for 22 years. I am particularly awed by what you're saying because of that reason, but also because there are two things that are close to my heart. First thing is where you mentioned a little bit at the end about the cost of what it took to get to the moon versus what it gave us in return. This is why Glass-Steagall is something I've fought for with this organization and continue to place as one of the #1 things, as Lyndon LaRouche does in his 4 laws. It is the beginning. And I'd like you to maybe comment a little bit about the Glass-Steagall situation that we need to have in order to get the funding that's necessary. When Kennedy was president, we had Glass-Steagall. We did not have a total breakdown of our economy as we do now. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we talk about teaching our children. And I'm so proud of Jose in him saying that he is out there trying to inspire people, trying to inspire older people. I'm a baby boomer, and baby boomers are a hard nut to crack. So, you know, it's hard to inspire people, especially in my generation, to think this way when, like you said, we are so diverted into other things. But I saw an article about teaching kids, and you guys were like 22, you said 23 young when this whole project, whole idea, whole inspiration began. So we need our young people to get inspired, to get back to that. I saw an article in one of our teachers' papers where the value of civics education goes far beyond politics. And I want to say the value of civics education includes NASA, includes the ideas of fusion, includes science, includes all those things that our children need to learn. It says we know that high quality civics education has a positive benefit for students, like for instance, critical thinking, civil debate, classroom confidence. Civics education improves school climate. I don't even know if people understand that that is a major problem in our schools, that kids don't want to go to school. School climate is awful. It actually increases the graduation rate because kids feel like they can participate in community service, in things that they love to do, which is hands-on things in science. And I wanted to throw that in there because, like I said, 2 things close to what everyone should be thinking about: Glass-Steagall and our children. Would you comment on that?
Tom, you want to go first?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm very proud of you that you've, for instance, you're a wonderful example because you've made the decision to take off the middle of a beautiful Saturday to come here and be involved with fellow Americans who want to make the country better. So you're not spending your time in a shopping mall or feeding a pigeon here and there. You're doing something really neat. And I hope your students get a chance to see the videos here that we had, because they will learn from that. And everybody else that I can see there in the audience, you are making a sacrifice to make it work. And the more people that can do that, the better off the world's going to be. Now, I happen to be still in touch with many of my ex-NASA colleagues. I'm down at Johnson Space Center every month or two, doing one thing or another. We're still using the knowledge that we acquired in our NASA days to do good things. Lately, I've been focusing on some of the subterfuges that people are talking about, climate change and things like that, which are, again, red herrings, trying to spend billions of dollars that we don't have to cure a problem that really doesn't exist. And at Johnson, our TRCS group is called The Right Climate Stuff, like the right stuff. And we're making sure that we use deviation analysis and other things that we learned while at the agency to get good answers to some of the tougher questions. But again, diversion is the real problem in society. You're being diverted. It's like the smoke and mirrors of the carnival hucksters who are trying to take your time and channel it elsewhere where it doesn't do good. Well, you've got your act together. You're in the right place. I am really, really pleased that you guys are here today. And you know, I'm in Maine right now talking to you. And by the way, this technology wouldn't have existed without Apollo either. Just kind of keep that in the back of your head, you know. Right. So anyway, that's my comment on what you said. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we're just going to go to the next one.
Echo.
Hello, I'm Stephen from. You kind of just hit upon the question that I had, and that would be, how are you affected in your daily missions and your work at NASA under the rouge of fake science and climate change and whatnot? How far has it set you back, and what can we do on the street as an organization to help you out?
Well, now keep in mind, I'm no longer working at NASA. After the Apollo days, I left to work at Pratt & Whitney for a while, make some jet engines. Then I ended up in insurance, using my mathematical skills to actually save people money. I haven't stopped. However, I still have kept those links up. And what can you do? Don't encourage anybody to drop out of school. Make sure that you get facts, okay? Facts and data. We have a sign that when people give a presentation at Johnson Space Center that goes up on a wall before they make the first slide. And it says, "In God we trust, everyone else bring data." And the fact is, it's data, real information. The fact is, I'll give you one for the New York area. The sea level rise in New York City is rising at a very steady, linear rate for well over 100 years. It doesn't deviate from this linear rate that it's rising. And yet CO2 has massively accelerated, 38% acceleration in the same period that sea level is still unchangingly linear. Now, if there was any effect of CO2 on sea level rise, you would see it in the data, and it just is not in the sea level data. And by the way, this is just not New York. Other areas all over the world show records of sea level rise that are in some cases falling. Norway, for instance, is still rising out of the ocean because the great ice sheets that were on it have gone. So people in Norway say, gee, look at that, sea level is dropping at 7 millimeters a year. Well, that's not true. Norway is rising. In places that are tectonically inert, which means they don't rise, they don't fall, the sea level seems to be linearly accelerating at about maybe 1 millimeter or so per year. Now, why is that? It's mainly thermal expansion from the sun. The upper layers of the ocean, when they warm a little bit, they take up more space because the molecular motion increases. And that's true all over the world. There is no CO2 signal visible in the sea level rise. And I hate to say it, some of my less honorable science colleagues have manipulated data trying to make it look like it is. You have to be able to see through that, study it, learn a lot. Go to the TRCS website, you can probably Google it, and you can see some of these presentations. There are other organizations that have been dedicated to telling the truth about climate. Heartland is one of them, and you can go to Heartland's website and look at all these presentations, including 4 or 5 that I've done for them, and look at sea level rise, look at hurricanes. Strength of hurricanes, by the way, seems to be declining even as CO2 goes up. Tornado activity is declining even as CO2 goes up. But you don't read that in the paper, but it's in the data. And again, data rules, find out where you can get accurate data, and the myth just disappears.
Thank you.
Okay, Diane's going to also respond.
I just want to add a couple of things, because actually, and you made the point, there is a requisite for the use of data, which is the ability to think, because people do all kinds of crazy things with statistics and numbers. And I wish I had the quote from Einstein here, but he obviously you do experiments, you have a hypothesis, and then about what will happen if, and then you look for an empirical result. But he said that the magnitude of the breakthrough of discovery was an inverse proportion to the amount of empirical evidence that you have. What does that mean? If you think about the things that he was working on, which was the theory of relativity and special relativity, and the experiments that he was doing were in the mind. That is, he talked about trains approaching the speed of light and observers on a bank watching these trains. Now, as of yet, we don't have trains that are anywhere near the speed of light. I'm not sure we will, although we may have spaceships that approach that. But he and all great scientists, he was able to construct such an experiment and conduct the experiment in his mind and come up with results which infuriated all of his so-called peers, and have been vindicated many years later, like the question of gravity waves, for example, which have just recently made themselves heard because we now have the instruments to measure such things. So I think this is it's a very funny, tricky, it's a peculiar question, because it is the case today, because we don't have a productive economy, that people think whatever arbitrary thing they want to say rules, and that you can do it this way and you can do it that way and it's all equally good. Obviously, if you're building something in the real world, the kind of materials you use, the size of whatever it is, all of these things are not arbitrary. They're very precise requirements to work in the physical, how it works. But in the domain of a discovery, and the challenge here, as Tom, you were saying earlier, in terms of getting to the moon, people were presented with problems, right? We have to be able to do X. If we're going to land a man on the moon safely and get him back to Earth, there are certain questions. How do we get through the atmosphere? How do we get them on the moon and figure out how to get them off? These things had never been done before. So it required people to actually think of things that had not been thought before, that had not been observed before, to develop a hypothesis and then to test it.
Thanks.
Hey, Diane, let me add to that a little bit, okay?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Going back to Einstein. Einstein had another quote too, and it had to do with lots of theoretical people who were claiming that he was totally wrong, and he said, "All I need is one experiment to prove me wrong. I don't need thousands of people trying to tell me." And the reason I bring this up, in 1919, actually before 1919, Einstein theorized that light would be bent when it passed past the sun, because the sun had this huge attraction of gravity. Now, the problem was the sun is so bright, nobody could ever check that out. But in 1919, there was a total eclipse of the sun, and a star very close to the sun that would be visible during that eclipse. And the distortion of that light and the apparent movement of that star would prove or disprove his theory. And guess what? In 1919, his theory of light being bent by gravity was proven indisputably, because it was measured by thousands of people on the Earth who looked at the eclipse. Now, August 21st this year, we're going to have another total eclipse. It's going to cross the entire United States. But you have to be either in Oregon or Wyoming or South Carolina or Tennessee to see it. It's not near New York. Here we'll only get a partial eclipse. And yet, during this eclipse, I believe the star Regulus, which is a very bright star, is going to be very close to the sun-moon axis. And we can again measure the extent of that gravity attraction of the sun on rays of light. We already know it works. Now we can refine that. We have better instrumentation now. We can refine it even better. And that will be one of the things that would be looked at during this eclipse. So if you have vacation time in August, try to find the center line, get decent eye protection for the non-total times, and enjoy a stunning eclipse, which, by the way, will be stunning because the sun has been getting weaker over the last cycles, and there should be a very disjoint corona or outer atmosphere of the sun, which will be visible during the eclipse. No one's seen it yet, but we will on the 21st of August.
Great. Thanks.
Einstein gets another posthumous A+.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for your very brief, but at the same time very potent, very inspiring presentation, I think, for all of us. And when you were mentioning during the time of the Apollo program that you and your colleagues were in your mid-20s, immediately it, sort of, I did, a little bit of math in my head, and it basically, well, it occurred to me that most of you were born during the time that Roosevelt was the president. And then politically, it sort of creates a parallel between that time period, the time period that you were working in, and the time period we're in today, because unfortunately, after Roosevelt died, we had Harry Truman come in. Trumanism and McCarthyism terrified a lot of people and led to, or attempted to lead to, a decisive paradigm change in our culture, in our society, to sort of erase most of the things that FDR had accomplished for society. And luckily for all of us alive today, that was largely unsuccessful. We had President Eisenhower, who was in the presidency, I believe, during the time that you guys were, starting the projects that would culminate with Kennedy's presidency and beyond that. And it seems like we have a similar sort of parallel situation now, although over a longer duration of time, where what Kennedy did and what you and your colleagues did was attempted, in large part, your accomplishments and others of the Kennedy era, to be dissolved and destroyed during the Cheney, Bush, and Obama administrations. And now, once again, we have someone in the White House who, while, needing a lot of things to, basically needing a lot of direction, wants to do the right thing and is doing a lot of optimistic things as well. So my question is, based on this parallel, I'm wondering if maybe you could share with us what you saw, especially in terms of economy, in terms of national politics, from the leaders around the time you and your colleagues were very serious about this project, maybe through the presence of Eisenhower, through the presence of FDR that you saw reflected, and through the presence, of course, of Kennedy, that you saw that led to this time period of great, great optimism that inspired you and others to do what you did, so that we can reproduce that and help President Trump to reproduce that in our nation today. Thank you.
Well, one of the things that is pretty clear to me is that President Trump is looking to cooperate across international boundaries instead of antagonize. And it's a huge difference. He wants to work with the Russians, with the Chinese, and the Chinese seem to want to do the same with us. Their One Belt, One Road policy is a blueprint for win-win cooperation. And the Chinese are very, they're self-serving in the sense that if they're developing markets in Africa by building railroads in Africa, they're basically trying to pull people out of an economy that is not a valuable customer for Chinese industry. And the example I use is if you have somebody living in a hut earning $2.80 a week, they're not going to buy a flat screen TV from you. And if the Russians are able to reignite the economies in Africa, they basically build a customer base, and that works two ways. So that international trade is the great way toward peace. And international cooperation in achieving that trade works. Now, you know, the One Belt, One Road is great. I've seen the map, how it looks all over the world. There is part of that that's missing, by the way, and that happens to be a Pacific trade route. The fact is China and the United States trade across the Pacific in these huge container ships. It's not a road, it's not a rail line, but the fact is the trade makes both countries work. And it's not just the two larger powers. The Chinese, I think, are talking about extending rail lines into Russia, and Russia can only benefit, and China can only benefit. And this is a heck of a lot better than shooting at each other. And what we have to do is put out some of those little fires in the world, like the North Koreans are trying to start up, and what's going on in Syria. I think recently we're making progress in Syria. Working with the Russians is a heck of a lot better than working against the rest of the world. I happen to be a big fan of the international cooperation. I've seen how its benefits work. I've also seen how they don't work. And believe me, working is a lot better.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to draw our meeting for the day to a close. We'll take summary statements now, and we'll start with Diane.
Well, I just want to go back to what Mrs. LaRouche said, which is that the Achilles heel of this administration is this economic collapse and this physical breakdown. And we are responsible to change that, which means to communicate this to others and to get them involved, like to this meeting, contributing to the LaRouche Political Action Committee, and to change the way they think. And I was thinking about the challenges that had to be surmounted by the people who decided that we were going to get to the moon. And I think the question for everyone here to take up, is it really the case? Could it really be the case that it is more difficult for us to move our fellow Americans and to get the policy that is required from Washington than it was to figure out how to land on the moon?
And so, Tom, you have any final words for us?
Yeah, well, we need to focus on doing what's good for humanity. The problems in getting to Phobos and to Mars are not insurmountable. The technology that we achieve in doing so will be spread throughout the entire planet. And everybody wins. If we don't get distracted, and Diane's mentioning a potential economic downturn, which I think is in the cards, because the people working against the president would like nothing to see that all come down. And that is where they are totally wrong-headed. We need to build the world up, not tear it down. Tearing things down is easy. Creating huge achievements is what's worth spending a lifetime on. I've been very, very proud to do that in my lifetime, and I think the people in this room are too. I'm not going to stop. You guys won't stop either. So celebrate our achievements. This is a great day to remember because it's the anniversary of the moon landings and the 40th Viking landers and things like that. We've done great things in the past, but the future lies ahead of us, and it is wonderful if we do the right things and don't get distracted.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. On that, we're just going to draw the meeting to a close. I want to thank everybody for coming today. We are about to now discuss some things about implementation here in New York. And so this will conclude our meeting for this week.